I spent my entire life building something, a future, a legacy, something to give to the one person who mattered most to me. My son, Jason. I sacrificed everything I had, every dream I put aside, just to give him the best life I could offer. I worked long hours, faced struggles alone, and did it all with a simple promise to myself. He'll have what I never did, and more. But as time went on, things started to change. Jason became someone I didn't recognize, a young man who didn't appreciate what was given to him, someone who began to take my sacrifices for granted. I thought I was giving him a foundation for success, but what I didn't see was the entitlement growing inside him. One day, I found out just how far he'd gone to take advantage of everything I'd worked for. It wasn't just a small mistake or an innocent error, it was betrayal. Jason had stolen from me, not just a few dollars, but a significant amount of money. Money that I had worked for, sweat and tears poured into every cent. He used it for his own lavish lifestyle, without a care in the world for how it affected me. That's when everything changed. I had to make a decision, not just for him, but for myself. I couldn't let this go on, not without teaching him a lesson he would never forget. I didn't know what to do at first, but then it hit me. This wasn't just about money. This was about respect, responsibility, and understanding the true value of what I had given him all these years. And so I made a plan that would change everything. For both of us. This hook sets the stage for a deeply emotional and dramatic story, pulling the viewer in with a powerful narrative about betrayal, sacrifice, and a father's ultimate decision to teach his son a life-changing lesson. Stephen had always believed in the idea that family was the most important thing in life. From the moment Jason was born, Stephen's whole world shifted. His own dreams were replaced with the simple but profound wish that his son would grow up to be a better version of himself. He had worked tirelessly, dedicating every waking hour to ensure that Jason had everything he needed. No matter the sacrifice, no matter how hard life got, Stephen never wavered in his commitment to his son's future. Growing up in a small, modest house, Stephen knew what it was like to go without. His childhood had been far from easy. He watched his parents struggle to make ends meet, constantly juggling bills and doing their best to keep food on the table. While he learned the value of hard work early on, it wasn't until he became a father that he truly understood the depth of sacrifice. Every shift he worked, every job he took, was done with the thought that one day, Jason would never have to experience the same hardships he did. He wanted better for his son. Stephen wasn't wealthy by any means. His job as a carpenter didn't bring in much more than a steady income, but he made it work. There were nights when he worked overtime just to make sure Jason had the latest school supplies, the clothes that fit the latest trends, and the opportunity to go to the best schools in town. The sacrifices were endless, but he never regretted them. Every time he saw the smile on Jason's face, he knew it was worth it. Jason, on the other hand, had grown up with everything. He didn't know what it was like to want for anything. His friends had to work part-time jobs to afford their luxuries, but not Jason. His father always provided. From a young age, Jason was given a comfortable life, one that allowed him to focus on his studies and hobbies rather than worry about the small things that troubled other kids. His life was filled with opportunities, and it wasn't long before he became accustomed to the perks that came with being Stephen's son. But Stephen always made sure to instill values of hard work, responsibility, and gratitude. He wanted Jason to understand the importance of what he was being given, to appreciate the sacrifices his father had made, and to grow into a person who valued more than just material possessions. He often told Jason stories about how he'd worked long hours and faced many obstacles to build the life they had now. "You'll never truly understand the value of something until you've worked for it," Stephen would say. "It's not about what you get, it's about what you give." Jason, however, didn't seem to get it. As the years went on, he started taking his father's sacrifices for granted. His gratitude slowly turned into entitlement, and he began to expect more, always more. Where Stephen had hoped to raise a humble and appreciative son, Jason became increasingly consumed by a sense of superiority. It wasn't just that Jason didn't understand what his father had done for him. He began to believe that everything he had was his by right. In his teenage years, Jason started to distance himself from his father's values. He wanted the latest gadgets, expensive clothes, and vacations to exotic places, all of which he knew his father couldn't afford without struggling. But Stephen always found a way to make it happen. Whether it was borrowing money, taking out loans, or skipping a meal to save up for Jason's desires, Stephen did it without hesitation. It was always about giving his son the best, even when it meant sacrificing his own well-being. The silence that followed their conversation felt like a weight on Stephen's chest. He stared at his phone. The call abruptly ended, and for a moment, he felt an overwhelming wave of doubt. Had he done the right thing? Was this truly the lesson Jason needed? Or had he just alienated his son forever? The thought lingered in his mind as he sat there, wondering if his actions would cause irreparable harm. He loved Jason, and every fiber of his being wanted to reach out to soften his stance, to give him the help he was used to getting. But the part of him that had been consumed by years of giving without teaching knew that it had to end. Jason didn't call back that evening, nor did he call the next day. The hours dragged by, and Stephen's anxiety deepened. He knew Jason was angry, maybe even hurt, but he couldn't shake the sense that this was the only way to truly help him. The silence was deafening, a sharp contrast to the constant flow of communication they had shared before. Days passed, and Jason didn't reach out. Stephen spent hours reflecting, wrestling with guilt and the sharp sting of rejection. He couldn't help but replay the conversation over and over in his mind. Was he too harsh? Should he have explained more, been softer? His own feelings of failure as a father resurfaced, threatening to undo the resolve he had worked so hard to build. Then, on the fourth day after their conversation, Jason appeared at the door. Stephen opened it slowly, surprised to see his son standing there. Jason's eyes were downcast, his posture stiff and defensive. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there in silence, the air between them thick with tension. "Dad," Jason said quietly, his voice lacking the usual defiance. "Can we talk?" Stephen's heart skipped a beat. He stepped aside, motioning for Jason to come in. The room was heavy with the weight of unspoken words as they sat down across from each other. Stephen didn't speak immediately. He waited for Jason to say what was on his mind. Jason shifted uneasily in his seat. "I don't know what to say," he began, his voice small. "I was really pissed off at you, at first. I didn't get it. I thought you were just done with me, that you didn't care anymore." Stephen remained silent, watching his son, waiting for him to continue. Jason took a deep breath and looked up, his eyes meeting his father's. "But then I thought about it, and I realized you were right. I've been acting like I'm entitled to everything, like I'm not responsible for my own messes. And you've always had to clean up after me. But I never really thought about what that did to you or how you felt. I just kept asking, expecting, without ever thinking about what I was taking." Stephen's heart clenched, hearing those words. For the first time in a long while, he saw a crack in the walls that Jason had built around himself, a flicker of understanding. Jason continued, his voice more composed now, though tinged with regret. "I don't know how to do this on my own," he admitted, his tone raw. "I've never had to, and that's on me. I've been selfish, and I've been taking you for granted. And I know I've hurt you." The weight in Stephen's chest loosened just slightly. Jason's admission, his willingness to acknowledge the truth, was the first step toward healing. It wasn't easy for either of them, but it was a start. "I don't know where to go from here, Dad," Jason said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "But I know I need to change, and I need to do it for myself, not just because you're telling me to. I've been hiding behind your help for too long, and it's not fair to you." Stephen didn't respond right away. He could see the struggle in Jason's eyes, the conflict between pride and the realization that he had to stand on his own. It was raw, and it was difficult, but Stephen knew that Jason was finally beginning to grasp the reality of what his father had been trying to teach him all these years. Finally, Stephen spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I'm proud of you for facing this, Jason, but it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to learn a lot, and you're going to make mistakes along the way. But I'm not going to fix it for you anymore. You've got to take responsibility for your own life, and that's the hardest thing I've ever had to teach you." Jason nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of guilt and determination. "I get it now, Dad. I'm ready to do the work." Stephen could feel the shift, the beginning of something new. It wasn't an immediate resolution, and the road ahead would be long and challenging. But this moment, this raw, honest conversation, marked the turning point. It was the beginning of Jason stepping into responsibility, and it was the first step toward rebuilding their relationship. Stephen stood up and placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. "I'm always here for you, son, but you gotta walk your own path now." Jason looked up at him, a mixture of gratitude and regret in his eyes. "I will, Dad. I promise." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Stephen believed him. The days following their conversation were filled with quiet but significant changes. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but there was a subtle shift in the air, a palpable sense of growth that both father and son felt, even if they couldn't fully articulate it just yet. Jason was beginning to understand the weight of the responsibility he had been avoiding for so long. And for Stephen, the decision to let go, to stop enabling his son, wasn't easy. But in the end, it was the best choice he could have made, not just for Jason, but for himself as well. Jason took his first steps toward real independence, not with the grand gestures of someone who thought he had it all figured out, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had finally understood that nothing worth having comes easily. He found a second job to help pay his rent, began to manage his finances more carefully, and even started attending counseling to help deal with some of the underlying issues that had fueled his sense of entitlement and irresponsibility. It wasn't perfect. There were stumbles along the way, moments when Jason wanted to give up or revert to old habits. But Stephen was there, not to bail him out, but to offer support, guidance, and a steady reminder that real growth comes from facing your mistakes head-on. Stephen watched Jason take these steps with a quiet pride. He knew that this wasn't the result of his own control or interference, but rather the product of Jason's own willingness to change. It wasn't about forcing him to grow up. It was about giving him the space to make his own choices, to learn the consequences of those choices, and to ultimately find the strength within himself to rise above them. For the first time, Stephen saw the man his son could become, the man he had always hoped Jason would be. But the change wasn't just in Jason. Stephen himself had grown, perhaps in ways he hadn't expected. Letting go of his need to constantly fix things for his son had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. It had felt like a betrayal in some ways, a rejection of the role he had always played in Jason's life. But through that painful process, Stephen had rediscovered his own strength. He had learned that love wasn't about rescuing someone from their mistakes. It was about allowing them to face those mistakes and helping them find their own way through. As time went on, the space between father and son, once filled with resentment and anger, began to fill with understanding. The walls that had been erected over the years, out of frustration and hurt, started to come down. Jason no longer expected his father to fix things for him. Instead, he sought his advice, his wisdom, not as someone to solve his problems, but as someone to guide him through the tough decisions he was now facing on his own. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the first time in years, Stephen didn't feel like he was carrying the burden of his son's life on his shoulders. He had done his part, and now it was Jason's turn to carry his own weight. One evening, after dinner, Jason sat down with Stephen. His face was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "I just want to thank you for everything. I know I messed up, and I know it's going to take time to make things right, but I'm getting there. I want you to know I'm doing it for myself now. Not because you told me to, but because I finally see what I've been missing." Stephen smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just the words that mattered. It was the sincerity behind them. Jason had finally grasped the lessons Stephen had spent years trying to teach. And in that moment, Stephen realized that sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones we have to let others learn for themselves. "You don't have to thank me, Jason," Stephen said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done this for yourself. You've taken control of your own life. That's all I ever wanted for you." Jason nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He had come a long way, and so had Stephen. They were no longer trapped in a cycle of dependency and resentment. They were standing on a new foundation, one built on trust, mutual respect, and the hard-earned understanding that love is not about giving everything away, but about helping someone find their own way. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy for either of them. But for the first time in a long time, Stephen felt a sense of peace. He knew that Jason was on the right path, and he was no longer afraid of the future. The lesson, though painful at times, had been learned. Jason had grown, and so had he. In the end, Stephen understood that the greatest gift he could give his son wasn't money, advice, or protection. It was the ability to stand on his own, to face the world with strength, responsibility, and a sense of self-worth. And as Jason walked out of the door that evening, Stephen realized that his son had finally become the man he had always hoped he would be. What about you? Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to make a tough decision for someone you love? Maybe you've been in Stephen's shoes, struggling with the balance between love and tough love. Or maybe you're Jason, facing the consequences of your actions and realizing that growth comes from within. It's never easy to make the right call, especially when it means letting go. But sometimes it's the hardest moments in life that lead to the most powerful transformations. So, I want to hear from you. How have you handled moments of conflict or betrayal in your relationships? What lessons have you learned, and how did they change you? Share your story in the comments below. Let's create a space for open conversation where we can support each other in our journeys, no matter how tough they may be. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content that dives deep into real-life lessons, growth, and emotional journeys. We all go through challenges, but by sharing our experiences, we can help each other grow stronger and more resilient. Also, if you know someone who could benefit from this story, someone who might be struggling with tough decisions in their own relationships, share this video with them. You never know, it could be just the perspective they need to make a change in their own life. Remember, growth isn't linear, and sometimes it takes the hardest lessons to truly evolve. Keep moving forward and keep growing. The best is yet to come. Jason was a smart kid, but his intelligence was often overshadowed by his growing sense of entitlement. He began to excel in school, but instead of seeing it as an opportunity to give back or make a difference, he saw it as a stepping stone to a life of luxury. He became more demanding and less appreciative. Stephen noticed the change, but he brushed it off as a phase. After all, he thought, Jason was still young, and the lessons of hard work and sacrifice would come with time. As Jason entered adulthood, he went off to college, and Stephen thought that maybe, just maybe, being on his own would give his son the chance to truly appreciate the value of money and hard work. But even in college, Jason's attitude didn't change. He racked up credit card debt, splurged on designer clothes, and partied in expensive clubs, all while Stephen continued to send him money, believing that it was his responsibility to help his son succeed. There was always the excuse that Jason needed the money for books, for food, for the essentials. But Stephen knew deep down that his son's spending habits were far from essential. Years passed, and Jason eventually graduated, landing a decent job at a marketing firm. By then, he was living a life of excess, living in an upscale apartment, driving a brand new car, and indulging in all the luxuries that Stephen had never been able to afford. But the more Jason had, the more he wanted. His spending habits grew out of control, and his debts began to mount. He couldn't keep up with his lifestyle, but instead of scaling back, he turned to the one source he knew would always provide for him, his father. Stephen began to notice the signs. He would get calls from Jason asking for money, always with a reason, a new car payment, a credit card bill, a rent deposit. And every time, Stephen gave. After all, he had always provided for his son, and he couldn't bear the thought of his son struggling. But deep down, he began to feel that something wasn't right. He had worked so hard to give Jason everything, but his son's greed and entitlement were beginning to feel like a betrayal. The tipping point came when Jason came to Stephen one afternoon, asking for a large sum of money to cover a few debts he had accrued. This wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the second, but something inside Stephen snapped. He had always believed that family meant everything, but now, with each request for money, he felt more like a provider than a father. Jason wasn't coming to him for advice or support. He was coming for money, and it wasn't just money for essentials. It was money to fund a lifestyle that Stephen had never agreed with. That afternoon, as Stephen handed over the money, something inside him shifted. He realized that Jason wasn't the young boy he had raised. The son who once said, "Thank you" for a simple meal or a toy was now a man who took and took without a second thought. The boy who once looked up to his father now looked at him like a wallet. The love Stephen had for his son hadn't changed, but his sense of duty and his belief in the values he had instilled in Jason had. Stephen knew that something had to change, and that's when he made the decision. He would teach Jason a lesson that would change everything, not just for his son, but for himself too. This moment marked a dramatic shift in Stephen's life. He had given everything for his son, but it was now clear that Jason needed to learn that respect, responsibility, and true value weren't things that could be bought with money. They had to be earned. And Stephen would teach him that in the only way that would get through to him, by taking control of his own future and showing Jason the true cost of betrayal. The realization hit Stephen harder than he ever expected. For years, he had sacrificed everything for Jason, putting his own dreams and needs on the back burner just to see his son succeed. He had given up sleep, comfort, and even his health to ensure Jason's future was secure. And yet, here he was, sitting in his small, dimly lit living room, feeling the weight of betrayal bearing down on him. Jason had always been his pride and joy, his reason for getting up every morning, his purpose. But lately, Stephen had felt a growing distance between them. It wasn't just the small, subtle signs, the long stretches without a call, the awkward conversations when they did speak. It was something deeper, something unspoken but ever present. Stephen began to see Jason not as the son he had once adored, but as a young man who saw his father as nothing more than a bank account. Jason had become consumed by his own desires, seeking the latest trends and luxuries while forgetting the very people who had helped him get to where he was. The problem wasn't just Jason's materialism. It was his complete lack of gratitude. Stephen had never once asked for anything in return. He didn't need praise or accolades. All he wanted was to see his son happy, to see him living the life he'd always dreamed of. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about Jason's reckless spending or his refusal to take responsibility for his actions. It was the fact that Jason had stolen from him. The discovery had been accidental. Stephen had been going through his financial records, checking to make sure his accounts were in order, when he noticed something strange. Large withdrawals, unfamiliar transfers, money that should have been accounted for. It didn't take long for him to realize the truth. Jason had accessed his accounts without permission. He had taken a significant amount of money, enough to fund his own lavish lifestyle for months. Stephen's heart sank. For years, he had poured every ounce of effort into providing for Jason. And this was the thanks he got? The sense of betrayal was unbearable, as though everything he had worked for had been turned into nothing but a means to an end for someone who didn't even understand the value of what he was given. He confronted Jason about it. Jason's response was cold and dismissive. He claimed it was just a temporary loan, that he would pay it back eventually. But Stephen could see it in his eyes. There was no guilt, no remorse, just a sense of entitlement, as if it were his right to take whatever he wanted. "You don't understand, Dad," Jason had said when Stephen asked him why he had done it. "You've always given me everything. I didn't think you'd mind if I took a little extra. It's not like you're going to miss it." The words stung like a slap in the face. Jason was looking at him as if his father's hard work, his sacrifices, meant nothing, as if it was all just a transaction, and Stephen was nothing more than a source of financial support. It was in that moment that Stephen realized his son had never truly understood the gravity of the life they had built together. Jason didn't value what he had because he didn't understand what it took to create it. Stephen had tried so hard to teach him the importance of hard work, of responsibility, of earning what you have. He had told him countless times that money wasn't everything, that respect, integrity, and love were the things that truly mattered. But all of those lessons seemed to have been lost on Jason. It was as if he had ignored them altogether in favor of living a life of luxury and excess, without a care for the people who had given him that privilege. The conflict didn't just stem from the financial betrayal. It was the deeper realization that Stephen had failed as a father. He had failed to teach Jason the very things that had driven him to work so hard in the first place. He had wanted to provide for his son, to give him everything he never had. But in doing so, he had created a monster, a young man who felt entitled to everything he wanted without ever having to work for it. The emotional toll this betrayal took on Stephen was overwhelming. His love for Jason hadn't diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger over the years. But now that love felt tainted. Every memory of late nights spent working, every sacrifice made, was overshadowed by the fact that his son had taken from him without a second thought. The pain of that realization was deep, far deeper than any financial loss could have been. The worst part? Stephen didn't know how to fix it. He had raised Jason with the best intentions, but now it felt like everything had backfired. He couldn't just give Jason a lesson in humility. He had to find a way to make him truly understand the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just about teaching him a lesson in responsibility. It was about showing him that actions had real-world consequences, that life wasn't a free ride, and that respect and trust couldn't be bought. As Stephen sat in his living room, staring at the empty coffee table, he knew that something had to change. But he wasn't sure how. The anger and hurt inside him were powerful, but they needed direction. He couldn't just let this slide, not without giving Jason the wake-up call he so desperately needed. But how could he show his son what it truly meant to work for what you have, to earn respect and gratitude, when everything he had worked for had been taken so casually? For the first time in his life, Stephen felt powerless. He had spent years building his own success, but now he was faced with a challenge that no amount of hard work or determination could fix. This was a battle for his son's soul, for the values that Stephen had worked so hard to instill in him. And he wasn't about to give up without a fight. But where to begin? How could he get Jason to see the damage he had done? Stephen didn't want to alienate him further, but at the same time, he knew that he couldn't let Jason continue down this path of entitlement and disregard. The conflict that now lay before him wasn't just about money. It was about family, about trust, and about the lessons that had been lost along the way. As the hours passed, Stephen began to think of a way to show his son the gravity of what he had done. He wasn't sure yet what his next steps would be, but he knew that he had to act. This wasn't just about punishing Jason. It was about making him understand, on a deep, personal level, that the real cost of betrayal wasn't measured in dollars and cents. It was measured in something far more valuable: love, trust, and the respect that comes from earning everything you have. The only question left was how far Stephen was willing to go to teach Jason this painful, life-changing lesson. The days that followed Stephen's discovery felt like an eternity. Every time he looked at Jason, he was reminded of the betrayal. The once close relationship between father and son had been replaced by a gnawing emptiness. Stephen had always prided himself on being a good father, on making sure Jason had everything he needed to succeed. But now, he was questioning everything. How had he missed the signs? How had he allowed his son to grow up believing that he was entitled to whatever he wanted, regardless of the cost? Jason didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of his actions. He showed no remorse, no understanding of the pain he had caused. Instead, he treated the theft like a minor inconvenience, something that would be easily rectified. "I'll pay you back, Dad," he had said nonchalantly, as if that would solve everything. But Stephen knew better. This wasn't about money. It never had been. It was about trust, trust that had been shattered by someone who should have been the last person to betray him. For days, Stephen struggled with the emotional weight of it all. He couldn't shake the feeling of failure. Had he been too lenient with Jason? Had he spoiled him? In his attempt to give Jason the world, had he inadvertently taught him that nothing had value unless it was given freely? Stephen couldn't help but wonder if his own actions, his constant giving, had set the stage for the very betrayal he now faced. He had always wanted to be the kind of father who provided for his son, who made sure he never had to go without. But now, looking at the wreckage of their relationship, Stephen wondered if he had been too generous, too accommodating. Maybe it wasn't just the money that Jason had stolen. It was the love, the respect, and the values that Stephen had tried to instill in him. He had tried to create a strong foundation for Jason, but somewhere along the way, that foundation had crumbled. And now his son was lost. The days turned into weeks, and Stephen's frustration only grew. Every time he spoke to Jason, there was a sense of distance, a coldness that hadn't been there before. Jason was still asking for money, still expecting his father to bail him out of his self-made messes. But this time, Stephen couldn't do it. He couldn't just keep handing over money without teaching his son a lesson. Every conversation with Jason felt like an emotional battleground. Jason would try to justify his actions, to downplay the severity of the situation, but Stephen was done listening to excuses. "You don't get it, do you?" Stephen would say, his voice breaking with the weight of his frustration. "This isn't just about money. It's about respect. It's about understanding the sacrifices I've made for you. It's about realizing that life isn't a free ride." But Jason didn't get it. He couldn't see beyond his own desires, his own needs. He still thought that if he could just convince his father to give him more, everything would be fine. Stephen had tried to explain time and time again that life wasn't about material things, but Jason wasn't ready to hear it. He was too focused on the here and now, on the immediate gratification of his wants. The emotional toll this took on Stephen was immense. Every time Jason came to him for help, every time he asked for more money, Stephen felt his heart break a little more. It wasn't the financial burden that hurt. It was the realization that his son didn't understand what it meant to truly work for something, to sacrifice for the things that mattered. Jason was blind to the true value of hard work, of earning respect, of being responsible for your actions. It was in these moments that Stephen began to feel the weight of his own choices. He had always wanted to provide for Jason, to give him a life of comfort and opportunity. But now, he wondered if he had gone too far. Had he given too much? Had he made it too easy for Jason to take without ever learning to give back? Stephen had tried to instill the values of hard work and respect, but now he saw that his actions had inadvertently reinforced the opposite. He had created a world for Jason where everything was handed to him, where he didn't have to work for anything. And now, Jason's sense of entitlement was unbearable. But even more than the frustration, there was a deep sadness that weighed on Stephen's heart. He had spent his life trying to be the best father he could be, but now it felt like it had all been for nothing. He had given everything for Jason's success, and yet Jason didn't seem to appreciate any of it. The emotional betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss ever could. It wasn't just the money that had been stolen. It was the trust, the bond between father and son that had been torn apart. As Stephen sat in his chair, staring out the window, he couldn't help but feel lost. He had always believed that his role as a father was to provide, to protect, and to guide his son. But now, it felt like he had failed in every way. His son didn't need him anymore. Not for guidance, not for wisdom, not for love. All he needed was money, and even that wasn't enough. It was a hollow existence for both of them. Stephen knew that something had to change. He couldn't continue down this path, watching as Jason spiraled further into a life of entitlement and irresponsibility. But how could he fix this? How could he teach his son the lessons he had failed to teach him earlier? He realized that the answer wasn't simple. The problem wasn't just about money. It was about values, about respect, and about responsibility. And in order to teach Jason those lessons, Stephen knew he had to take a step back. He couldn't keep enabling him, couldn't keep giving him the money he asked for. Jason needed to learn that life didn't work like that there were consequences to his actions, and that respect wasn't something that could be bought. It had to be earned. But as Stephen thought about the future, he knew that the path ahead wouldn't be easy. The emotional stakes were higher than ever. If he was going to teach Jason the hard truths, he knew it would come at a cost. Their relationship might never be the same again. And that thought, knowing that his son might never look at him the same way again, was the hardest part to bear. Still, Stephen knew he couldn't let this go on. He couldn't let Jason continue down this destructive path. The emotional toll it had taken on him was unbearable, and if he didn't act now, it would only get worse. Something had to change, no matter the cost. And Stephen was ready to make that change. The weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier each day for Stephen. As time passed, the emotional distance between him and Jason became more apparent. It wasn't just the financial betrayal that lingered. It was the unspoken truth that their relationship, which had once been founded on trust, love, and shared moments, was now fractured beyond repair. Stephen had spent years building a life for Jason, a life he thought would bring them closer. But now it seemed that all those efforts had led them in the opposite direction. Jason's behavior had worsened in the weeks following the discovery of his theft. His demands for money were becoming more frequent and more brazen, each request delivered with a sense of entitlement that sent a pang of hurt through Stephen. He would call or text, asking for this or that, explaining how his car payments were overdue, how he couldn't pay rent, how his credit card bills were piling up. Every time, Stephen felt a knot form in his stomach, knowing that his son, the one he had worked so hard for, had fallen deeper into a pit of irresponsibility and greed. Stephen had tried to offer guidance, to tell Jason that money wasn't the solution to his problems, but it seemed to fall on deaf ears. Jason didn't want to hear about responsibility or hard work. He just wanted the easy way out, the quick fix. He didn't want advice. He just wanted more. The conversations had become rehearsed, predictable, and draining. Stephen began to dread picking up the phone, fearing yet another request, yet another reminder of how far apart they had grown. The more Stephen thought about it, the more he realized that Jason wasn't the same person he had raised. The boy who once looked up to him for guidance had turned into someone who saw his father as a source of income. The realization that Jason no longer respected him as a person, as a father, cut deeper than any betrayal ever could. It wasn't the money that mattered to Stephen. It was the fact that Jason had no understanding of the sacrifices Stephen had made, no appreciation for the years of hard work that had gone into providing him with a better life. But what was worse was that Stephen couldn't seem to break through to him. Jason wasn't listening, and worse, he wasn't even trying to understand. Every conversation felt like a battle, but it wasn't a battle Stephen knew how to win. He had tried everything, logic, patience, even tough love, but nothing had worked. Jason remained steadfast in his belief that his father would always come through, no matter how irresponsible he became. And that belief, Stephen realized, was the crux of the problem. Jason had no sense of consequences. He didn't understand that actions had repercussions. He thought the world owed him everything because he was Stephen's son. The guilt and regret Stephen felt only compounded the situation. He had given Jason everything he could. He had provided opportunities, support, and the best of everything. But in his efforts to give Jason the world, he had failed to teach him the most important lessons, the ones about hard work, responsibility, and integrity. It felt like Stephen had created a world where Jason never had to struggle, never had to fight for what he wanted. And in doing so, he had inadvertently enabled the very entitlement and irresponsibility that now threatened to tear their relationship apart. The emotional toll was taking a serious toll on Stephen's health. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying every decision he had made for Jason, wondering if he could have done something differently. Had he been too generous? Had he been too lenient, giving Jason too much without teaching him the value of earning it? Stephen had worked hard to build a better life for his son, but now it seemed like all of it had been in vain. The thought that Jason might never understand what he had sacrificed was a bitter pill to swallow. Stephen started to pull away, emotionally and physically. He wasn't just distancing himself from Jason. He was also distancing himself from the world around him. He felt isolated, like he was carrying a weight no one else could understand. His relationship with his friends began to suffer as he withdrew into himself, consumed by the stress of trying to fix a situation that seemed beyond repair. His work suffered as well. What had once been a source of pride and fulfillment had become just another reminder of how much he had given and how little he had received in return. And yet, as much as Stephen hated the way things had turned out, there was still a part of him that couldn't let go. He still loved Jason. No matter how much his son had hurt him, no matter how many times he had betrayed his trust, Stephen's love for him remained constant. It was a love that ran deep, deeper than the anger, deeper than the disappointment. It was the kind of love that only a parent could understand, the kind of love that was unconditional even in the face of betrayal. This internal conflict between the love he still had for Jason and the anger he felt toward him was slowly consuming Stephen. Every time he looked at his son, he felt a mixture of sadness and resentment. He had given so much, and yet it seemed like Jason couldn't even appreciate the effort, let alone the sacrifices. It was as if nothing Stephen did mattered anymore. The anger he felt was justified, but it was also clouded by the nagging voice in his head that reminded him of the love he had for Jason. The love that never seemed to fade, no matter how much Jason hurt him. There were times when Stephen wanted to give up, to walk away and never look back. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He was a father, and that bond was not something he could sever so easily. So instead, he withdrew even further, building up walls around himself to protect his heart from the pain of his son's actions. He didn't know what else to do. He had tried everything, and yet nothing had worked. Jason continued to live in his world of entitlement, while Stephen remained trapped in a cycle of hurt and disappointment. The distance between them had grown so wide that Stephen began to wonder if there was any way back. Could they ever rebuild the relationship they once had? Was it even possible to teach Jason the lessons he needed to learn after everything had gone so wrong? The questions lingered in Stephen's mind, unanswered and unsettling. But one thing was certain. He couldn't keep living like this. He couldn't keep sacrificing his own peace of mind, his own happiness, for someone who wasn't willing to change. The conflict had reached a breaking point, and Stephen knew that something had to give. But what? What could he do to make Jason see the light? And more importantly, was Jason even capable of change? These were the questions that haunted Stephen as he faced the harsh truth. Sometimes, the hardest thing a parent can do is let go, even when their love for their child hasn't wavered. The days felt like they were passing by in a blur for Stephen, as if time itself had become suspended in the tension that had built up between him and Jason. Every day, Stephen tried to go about his routine, but the weight of what had happened hung over him like a cloud. He would go to work, he would do what he needed to do, but his mind was never fully there. Every conversation with Jason, every moment of silence between them, was filled with unspoken words, emotions, and regrets. The emotional toll had started to manifest physically. Stephen had trouble sleeping. He wasn't eating like he should, and the constant stress had left him feeling drained. He tried to tell himself that things would get better, that somehow Jason would come around, but deep down, he knew the truth. The way things were going, there was no way forward without a drastic change. They couldn't keep living in this broken state. The tension between father and son had reached a boiling point, and Stephen knew that something had to give. It wasn't until one quiet evening, sitting in the dim light of his living room, that the realization struck Stephen like a thunderclap out of nowhere. He had been sitting alone, staring at a family photo that had once meant everything to him. It was a picture of him and Jason, taken years ago, when everything still felt simple. Jason had been a young boy then, looking up at his father with admiration, love, and trust. Stephen had spent so many years trying to give him everything, to be the father who could provide for his son in every way. But now, it felt like that love and admiration had slipped through his fingers, replaced with betrayal and frustration. As Stephen sat there, lost in thought, something inside him shifted. For the first time, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had been looking at the situation all wrong. Up until that point, he had been seeing this as a failure on his part, a failure to raise Jason the way he wanted, a failure to instill the right values, a failure to be the perfect father. But now, he began to wonder if the true failure lay not in what he had done for Jason, but in how Jason had come to expect it. Stephen had been so focused on providing for Jason, on giving him a life of comfort and success, that he had overlooked one critical thing. Jason needed to learn the value of what he had. He had been giving so much, without teaching Jason the true cost of it all. In his efforts to protect Jason from hardship, Stephen had inadvertently created an environment where Jason didn't understand the importance of hard work, responsibility, or earning what you have. He had made it too easy for Jason, had made him feel entitled to a life of luxury without ever having to work for it. This realization hit Stephen like a wave, overwhelming him with both guilt and clarity. The truth was painful. He had been enabling Jason all along, giving him everything without making him understand the effort it took to get there. He had sacrificed his own dreams, his own needs, and in doing so, had created an environment of dependency. Jason had grown up with everything handed to him, and somewhere along the way, that sense of entitlement had taken root. He had never been taught that nothing in life comes free. He had never learned to work for what he wanted, to fight for it, to earn it. And now, Jason's actions, the theft, the demands, the complete disregard for his father's sacrifices, were the result of a life where everything had been given without question, without consequence. Stephen closed his eyes, the weight of the realization sinking deep into his chest. He had spent so much time blaming Jason, blaming the way he had turned out, that he had never truly stopped to examine his own role in it. He had created this situation. He had made it too easy for Jason to expect. He hadn't made Jason earn anything. And now, the emotional rift between them had become too wide to bridge without a radical change. The turning point for Stephen wasn't in what Jason had done, but in how he had failed to teach him. For so long, Stephen had believed that love meant giving, and giving meant everything would be okay. But now he understood that true love wasn't just about giving. It was about teaching, about showing the person you love how to stand on their own 2 feet, how to value what they had, how to earn the respect of those around them. The anger and resentment Stephen had felt toward Jason began to dissipate. It wasn't gone, but it had been replaced by something else, a sense of responsibility. Stephen now saw that his son wasn't just a product of his own failings. Jason was a victim of his own entitlement. Yes, but he was also a victim of Stephen's own misguided attempts at love. He had done everything for Jason, but he hadn't prepared him for the real world. The world where respect had to be earned, where nothing comes without hard work and sacrifice. In that moment, Stephen knew what he had to do. He could no longer continue the way he had been. He couldn't keep enabling Jason's destructive behavior, couldn't keep giving him money and support without teaching him the lessons he so desperately needed to learn. It was time to make a change, even if it meant taking a hard, painful step that would be difficult for both of them. The first step, Stephen realized, was to stop giving. He had to stop being the crutch Jason leaned on every time he made a mistake, every time he needed an easy way out. If Jason was ever going to learn to appreciate what he had, to understand the value of hard work and responsibility, he had to be forced to confront his own mistakes. Stephen couldn't keep bailing him out. He couldn't keep allowing Jason to believe that he was entitled to everything without ever having to work for it. But this decision wasn't just about stopping the flow of money. It was about setting boundaries, about showing Jason that love isn't about enabling, but about preparing someone for the realities of life. It was time for Stephen to stop giving in the way he always had, and instead teach Jason that love also means tough love. As the realization settled within him, Stephen felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. The road ahead would be difficult, painful even, but it was the right thing to do. He couldn't continue to enable Jason's behavior. And while it would hurt, he knew that this was the only way to give Jason the one thing that would truly help him in the long run: the ability to stand on his own, to earn his own way, and to respect what he had. Stephen had learned the hard way that sometimes love meant stepping back, even when it felt impossible. And in that moment, he knew that this revelation, this turning point, would be the beginning of a new chapter in their relationship. A painful one, but one that would, in the end, lead to growth for both of them. The decision was made. Stephen had spent weeks agonizing over it, but now that the moment had arrived, he couldn't back down. He had finally realized what needed to be done. He had to stop enabling Jason, stop providing the easy way out, and force him to confront the consequences of his actions. It was no longer about protecting his son from the world. Stephen had learned the hard way that it was about preparing Jason to face it. The next time Jason called, Stephen was ready. His heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang, but he didn't hesitate. He had to do this, even though every part of him wanted to give in, wanted to continue providing the comfort and security he had always given. But this time it was different. This time, Stephen had to stand firm. "Hey, Dad." Jason's voice came through, casual and carefree. "I've got a situation. My rent's due, and I'm a little short. I was wondering if you could help me out again, just until I get paid next week." For a moment, Stephen was silent. Jason had no idea what was coming. The words Stephen had been rehearsing in his mind for days now felt like they were caught in his throat. He swallowed hard, willing himself to stay calm, to stay strong. "Jason," Stephen began, his voice steady but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I've come to a decision. I'm not going to help you with this one." Jason's response was immediate, laced with disbelief. "What do you mean? You've always helped me before." "I need this, Dad." "I know you need it," Stephen said, his voice softening just a little. "But you've got to understand something. I've been doing this for years, giving you everything, bailing you out every time you're in a bind. But you've never had to face the consequences of your actions. And it's time for that to change." Jason was silent for a moment, the shock palpable on the other end of the line. "What? You're really not going to help me? After everything I've done for you? Everything I've been through?" His voice was rising now, frustration creeping in. "I don't understand. You always come through for me, no questions asked." "That's the problem, Jason," Stephen replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "I've always come through for you, but you've never learned to stand on your own. You've never learned the value of hard work, of responsibility, of earning your way. And now, I'm not going to make it easy for you anymore." Jason let out a harsh laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You can't be serious. You've always helped me. Always. Now you're going to turn your back on me when I need you the most." "I'm not turning my back on you," Stephen said, his voice strong. "I'm teaching you something that you need to learn. I've spent your whole life making sure you didn't have to face hard truths, but that ends now. You've got to learn to face your mistakes, deal with your problems, and take responsibility. I won't be the one to solve them for you anymore." Jason's silence on the other end was deafening. For the first time, there was no anger in his voice, no argument. Just silence. Stephen could hear him breathing heavily, processing the words. The weight of what he had just said hung in the air, and Stephen knew this was the moment that would define their future. He had set the boundary, and now it was up to Jason to respond. Finally, Jason spoke, his voice quieter than before, but still with an edge of disbelief. "I don't get it, Dad. Why are you doing this to me now, after everything we've been through?" "Because I love you, Jason," Stephen said, his voice softening but resolute. "I've loved you your whole life, and I've always wanted the best for you. But love isn't about just giving. It's about teaching you how to live, how to earn what you have, and how to be responsible for your own life. And right now, I'm teaching you that lesson, even if it's hard." There was another long pause. For a moment, Stephen thought Jason might hang up, might storm off, and refuse to speak to him again. The tension was unbearable, but Stephen stood firm. He knew that this was the moment he had to follow through, no matter how painful. Jason finally spoke again, his voice quieter, more resigned. "I don't know if I can do this, Dad. I don't know how." "You'll learn," Stephen said, "but only if you face the truth. You got this, Jason. It's time to grow up." Jason didn't respond right away. There was no angry outburst, no desperate plea for help. It was as if, for the first time, Jason had truly heard what his father was saying. The conversation ended with a heavy silence, and Stephen knew that this was a turning point. Whether it was for the better or worse, he didn't know. But he had done what he had to do. He had set the boundary, and now it was in Jason's hands.